My name is Fred Evans. I'm in the philosophy department, and I'm the coordinator for the Center of Interpretive and Qualitative Research, which we refer to as, by its acronym, CEECR. And I want to make a couple thanks before we start. I want to thank the CEECR Graduate Student Fellow for this year, Nathan Ekstrand, who does all the nuts. Yes, we can give him a hand. He takes care of the nuts and bolts and makes the whole thing go. But also helping him is the Office of the Dean of the College and Graduate School of Liberal Arts. They're very helpful, and they allow me to cut a lot of red tape, which makes this possible too. And then the CEECR Steering Committee that advises me and it makes suggestions for the CEECR program. So I want to thank all of them. For the past couple of years, what we've been doing at CEECR is taking a theme and then working the whole year on it. 2 years ago, it was the theme of migrancy. So we looked at interpretive and qualitative research in relationship to migrancy. Then this year, it's been on aesthetics. So we've looked at interpretive and qualitative research in relationship to the general idea of aesthetics and art. Each month we have a presentation by Duquesne faculty, but also faculty from the University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon University, and other academic institutions in the city. To give you an idea of some of the things we've been covering for the last year, I'll just mention what we've done thus far, this being the culminating event tonight. At first, an early talk was on 9/11 and the politics of aesthetics in literature and memorial art. That was followed by another presentation on the Civil War and the origins of modern commemoration. And then that by a talk on the digital humanities and its relationship to literary theory. And then an aesthetics of the moving body, so think of dance, for example. And then another talk on space, but the relationship between art and neuroscience with respect to the concept of space. And then another on landscape aesthetics, particularly in relation to Benjamin Henry Latrobe and his landscape designs. And then the talk just before the one tonight was on art and its relationship to the meaning of war. And the talk was entitled Out of Rubble, Towards Empathic Unsettlement. So we come tonight to our culminating or crowning event of the year. And this typically with CEECR consists of an external speaker, an invited external speaker that is somebody from outside the Pittsburgh area. And we usually ask the external speaker to do a public address. That's what's going to happen tonight. And then there's a smaller, more specialized symposium tomorrow, Friday. The professor we have as our external speaker is Professor Erika Doss. She's an art historian with the Department of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame. She is also co-editor of the Cultural America series at the University Press of Kansas, and on the editorial boards of Memory Studies, Public Art Dialogue, and Material Religion, the Journal of Objects, Art, and Belief. But we can get a sense of the breadth and the depth of her work in American art and visual culture by just going quickly through some of her single-authored books, the titles of them. Her earliest was Benton, Pollock, and the Politics of Modernism, from regionalism to abstract expressionism. That was followed then by, I like this title a lot, Spirit Poles and Flying Pigs, Public Art and Cultural Democracy in American Communities. And then another book on Elvis culture, Fans, Faith, and Image, and then 20th century American art, and then one of the ones that I appreciate very much, her most recent book, Memorial Mania, Public Feeling in America, American memorials. This last book is a special interest to me. I read it a couple of years ago and was completely taken by it. There was a lot I needed to learn about art history, and this provided me a good deal of that. But in the book, Professor Doss gives a comprehensive and detailed picture of memorials in the U.S., and she relates the type of memorials to different types of public feeling, and also the need for such expression in the U.S. to the point of a kind of mania, memorial mania. She also discusses with I felt really poignant descriptive power and insight the relation of these public memorials to the social and political issues that they express and that they provoke us to think about. So we can get a little bit more of this tonight, because her talk, the title will give you the direction it's going, is The Aesthetics of Victimization, Commemorating Loss, Violence, and Catastrophe in Contemporary Public Art. So let's have a big hand.
Thanks, Fred, and thanks to the Seeker program for bringing me in this evening. Can everybody hear me? And can everybody see the images? Are they legible? Is it too bright? Yes. Yeah, I'm wondering if we could bring the lights down just a tad. I hope we can bring it. Does that work? Okay, all right. All right. Sure. Anyhow, thank you for coming out in this rainy, kind of coolish evening, so we can talk about victim memorials and the aesthetics of victimization. Memorial culture is flourishing today, especially in terms of heated social, political, and emotional concerns. Last year in Glendale, California, for example, this bronze memorial was dedicated to the 200,000 comfort women, mostly from Korea, and many of them young girls, who were used as sex slaves by Japanese armies during World War II. Japan has never officially apologized for this gross violation of human rights, which South Korean and Korean American citizens have long agitated for. Their comfort women memorials, including this one in New Jersey on the bottom, are keyed toward raising public consciousness about this historical episode and their cause. They infuriate many Japanese who charge that these sorts of memorials spread false propaganda and demand their removal. Here we see a Japanese delegation protesting Glendale's memorial with a banner, and I especially like this, reading, "Children need heartwarming monuments." And just last month, a group called Global Alliance for Historical Truth filed a federal lawsuit demanding the removal of Glendale's memorial on the grounds that it, quote, infringes upon the federal government's power to exclusively conduct the foreign affairs of the United States and violates the supremacy clause of the US Constitution. All this in a single memorial. A Los Angeles law firm has picked up the case for the city pro bono, recognizing its fairly important ramifications for freedom of speech, especially at the local level. Glendale's memorial is not uncommon. In recent decades, literally thousands of memorials dedicated to those harmed by political, social, religious, economic, and cultural injustices, to the victims of disaster and catastrophe, have materialized in various public landscapes. So in my talk tonight, I'd like to situate these memorials in revisionist understandings of history, including ethical imperatives to remember those who have been forgotten or marginalized, a strong emphasis on linking the past with the present, and heightened expectations of emotionally engaged forms of public art and architecture. I'd also like to consider how an aesthetics of victimization might act as a site of conscience. Consider, for example, the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial, designed by Carla Stetson, dedicated in Duluth, Minnesota in 2003. The memorial recalls the June 1920 murders of 3 African-American men employed with the John Robinson Circus, which had stopped in Duluth for a single day of performances. Falsely accused of sexually assaulting a local white woman, the men were arrested and incarcerated in Duluth's downtown jail. That night, a mob of 10,000 people, and the slide on the right gives you some sense of that mob, and 10,000 was about 1/10 of Duluth's population in 1920. The mob attacked the jail, grabbed the prisoners from their cells, took them about 3 blocks uphill, and lynched them from the crook of the electric light pole that we see on the left. Built directly across the street from the site of lynching. So where I'm standing taking this photograph is exactly where the lynching occurred. Daluz Memorial is a small courtyard plaza with a curving sidewalk and beige-colored walls, which feature the words of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and various others. The walls are bordered with a quote from 18th century British philosopher and statesman Edmund Burke. An event has happened upon which it is difficult to speak and impossible to remain silent. The sidewalks feature the words respect, compassion, and atonement. And the memorial's main iconographic element is on the far right. 3 life-size bronze figures dedicated to the 3 men who were murdered in Duluth: Elias Clayton, age 19, Elmer Jackson, 22, and Isaac McGee, age 20. And this memorial is the first in the United States to the victims of lynching, which the NAACP declared in November 1920, just a few months after this event in Duluth, quote, the greatest shame in the United States. Duluth's memorial is part of a larger commemorative movement that I call memorial mania, a pervasive preoccupation with issues of memory and history, accompanied by urgent desires to express and to claim those concerns in visibly public context. Those that focus on shameful historical moments, such as racial and sexual terrorism, raise questions about how to remember, how to represent, and perhaps redeem those histories. In Duluth, for example, citizens deeply ashamed of their city's failure to curtail racial violence in June of 1920 and determined that such shameful acts never be repeated, came together to build the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial. Interestingly, the National Park Service has taken a leadership role in developing spaces that commemorate some of these shameful histories. Sites of shame, the Park Service declared in 1994, should be included in the park system to present a complete picture of our history. In 2002, the Park Service began reckoning with the remains of the President's House in Philadelphia, where George Washington and John Adams and at least 9 African slaves that they owned while each was president lived from 1790 to 1800. Located next to Independence Hall, the house's former slave quarters are just 5 feet from the entrance to the Liberty Bell Center, where the nation's premier icon of freedom is displayed. Although the President's House itself was demolished in the 1830s, the Park Service launched an archaeological dig at the site and committed several $1 million towards its commemoration. Dedicated in 2010, the memorial, which we see here, consists of low walls that roughly frame the footprint of the original brick house, rectangular slabs with mock fireplaces and video screens, and an interpretive program of images, text, and sound recordings centering on freedom and slavery in making the new nation. It will give us an opportunity to talk about the heroic and the shameful that took place on this site, observes the superintendent of Independence National Historical Park, who adds, "We the people applies to everyone who is part of what made this nation." Today's memorial mania is driven by heated debates over self-definition, national purpose, the politics of representation, by adamant assertions of citizen rights by diverse publics, and persistent demands for representation and respect. What we see here is a memorial to the victims of slavery on the campus of the University of North Carolina. This was designed by Korean sculptor Do Ho-soo, and it pays homage to the slave labor that built much of the UNC campus prior to the 1860s. Now these issues, diverse publics, politics of representation, these issues are not entirely new. There were plenty of conversations about appropriate subjects, appropriate styles, appropriate text, and intentionality during the post-Civil War era, the statue mania era, when patriotic lobbies and nostalgic constituencies erected many memorials to certain historical subjects. And one of these is the Pioneer Monument that we see here, dedicated in Denver in 1911 to Colorado's Anglo-American settler colonialist. But, as Kirk Savage observes, the memorials made a century or more ago were, quote, not meant to revive old struggles and debates, but to put them to rest, to show how great men and their deeds had made the nation better and stronger. Commemoration was a process of condensing the moral lessons of history and fixing them in place for all time. I think memorial mania, by contrast, is less convinced of seamless or shared narratives and far less engaged in a triumphal national history. Rejecting a collective or consensual ideological framework, many of today's memorials are marked by conflict, rupture, loss, by interest among artists and audiences alike in revisionist and often unsettling accounts of history. Many are commissioned specifically to address difficult, complex, and shameful historical subjects. Ours is an age of heightened anxiety about memory and history. After decades of postmodern criticism, widespread recognition of the fundamentally constructed nature of knowledge has led us to reject fixed, official, consensual understandings of historical causes and events. Yet, we certainly have not rejected history. We're consumed by thoughts about what is historical, who is historically significant, and how to remember. Today, our grasp of history is largely inseparable from our fascination with memory, an obsession, as Andreas Huijsen puts it, that relates to the following. First, acts of memory are charged with the formation and reformation of personal, social, and national modes of identity. Second, our insights about memory are inherently presentist. As Maurice Halbwachs observed, even at the moment of reproducing the past, our imagination remains under the influence of the present. And third, acts of remembering are predicated by fears about forgetting, about not properly accounting for the nuances of history, about accusations, perhaps, of cultural amnesia. Much of today's memory work is driven by ethical imperatives to remember those who have been forgotten or ignored in history. Their inclusion as historical subjects often upsets traditional or accepted historical narratives by acknowledging new or different narratives of oppression, struggle, and resistance. Their representations, such as in this memorial to the abolition of slavery, designed by Christophe Wojcicko and Julien Bonder and dedicated in Nantes, France in 2012, is typically rooted in contemporary concerns about rights and respect. Nantes, for example, became an extremely wealthy French city in the 19th century due to its central role in the slave trade. More than 45% of France's slave ships to Africa began their journeys in this port city. Built at a time when nations like France are confronting shameful moments in their past, Nantes' memorial also raises consciousness about the city's role in present-day human trafficking, which is a huge concern. Today's heightened emphasis on victim commemoration originates in the recovery and remembrance of the Holocaust. In the 1980s, Holocaust memorials began to gain intensified political and public presence around the world. Today, there are more than 3,000 such memorials in Germany alone, and another 1,200 in Poland. Others have been built at considerable distance from the camps and countries where the genocide of Jews, Gypsies, queers, Catholics, and others took place. In the United States, for example, there are hundreds of different Holocaust memorials, monuments, and museums located in many different cities, and I include just a few examples here. Growing attention to the victims of Nazi persecution has prompted the making of other memorials to other victims at other historical moments. In Buenos Aires, for example, the monument to the victims of state terrorism. And this is sort of an interesting memorial. It's permanent, and yet there are always things that are being added on, so parts of it are temporary. This was dedicated in 2007 in remembrance of those who were murdered during Argentina's political dictatorship of 1976 to 1983. In Moscow, the memorial to the victims of the Gulag was erected in 1990, dedicated to the millions of Russians who were imprisoned in forced labor camps during the Stalinist era. And this is also interesting in that it's a gigantic hunk of stone taken from one of the gulags and placed on a slab where there used to be a gigantic statue of the founder of the KGB. So her placement in terms of political memory here. In Washington, the Victims of Communism Memorial was dedicated in 2007, and we see President Bush at the dedication ceremonies on the right. In New York, this memorial to the 146 victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 will be dedicated later this year. It's an interesting memorial. It consists of sort of light and metal coming down on the side of the building. And then as you can see on the slide on the right, there are people who are looking up. And in that sort of band underneath are listed the names and birth and death dates of the 146 people who died in that fire. In Madrid, this memorial to the 190 victims of a terrorist attack on Atocha train station on March 11, 2004, was dedicated in 2007. I'm just showing you a lot of different examples. In Dublin, a memorial to the victims of the Great Famine, 1845, 1849, was erected in 1997 on the city's Custom House Quay. In Nanjing, this memorial to the Chinese victims of atrocities committed by the occupying armies of Japan in 1937 opened in 1985. It's been rededicated and revised 3 times since then. And in Mexico City, acclaimed public and new media artist Raphael Lozano Hemera organized this one-day memorial to the student victims of the 1968 massacre led by government troops against peaceful protesters. Estimates are that there were anywhere from 300 to thousands of students that were massacred. This is not entered into the Mexican textbooks yet. Memorials to the victims of plane crashes, car accidents, natural disasters, and disease are also increasingly present. In 2012, this memorial was dedicated in Clarence, New York, to the 49 people who died when their regional airplane crashed due to pilot error. Thousands of temporary memorials to the victims of car accidents can be seen along highways all over the world. Here we see some of the memorials dedicated to the victims of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, including on the upper left, a memorial designed by Louise Bourgeois. And in La Gloria, Mexico, this memorial was dedicated to the first known victim of H1N1, the deadly swine flu that killed more than 500,000 people from 2009 to 2010. Memorials to the victims of slavery, I think, are especially growing in number, and quite a few recent scholars and historians are working on this material. In Europe and England, they have been dedicated in Amsterdam, Bristol, Lancaster, Liverpool. In Africa, they have been built in Cape Town, Zanzibar, and Senegal. In the Caribbean, slavery memorials can be seen in Curacao, Kingston, Martinique, and also in Cuba. And in the United States, they've been erected in Savannah, Richmond, Chapel Hill, which we saw, and the US Capitol Visitor Center, where this memorial or marker recognizing the African American slaves who built the nation's capital through the early 1860s was dedicated in 2012. At its New York headquarters, the United Nations is planning this multi-million-dollar memorial addressing the transatlantic slave trade. And we see on the left the designer who's been chosen for this memorial. As the chair of the UN Memorial Committee told reporters, "It is right that we should have this monument. It will right a wrong, which is that the international community has never before acknowledged this tragedy. And we think that the monument should be a tangible manifestation of what the UN and the UN Charter stand for." Not too long ago, history's winners, its warriors, generals, presidents, were the primary commemorative subjects of both national and local public art. But today's memorials veer towards history's victims. In terms of numbers, this isn't especially surprising. Eric Hobsbawm estimated that between 1914 and 1991, more than 187 million people were killed or allowed to die, the victims of politically motivated violence of all kinds. And most scholars consider this number too low. What we're looking at here are various examples of the Holodomor memorials or hunger extermination memorials, which refer to the moment when 7 million Ukrainians died of forced starvation because of the Soviet grain embargoes. And this was in the early 1930s. Importantly, memorialized victims are not cast as losers in a sort of simple binary with history's winners. Rather, many victim memorials define history on new terms as active and activist projects charged with bearing witness and righting wrongs. Victim memorials often recover histories that are traumatic and deeply troubling, especially in nation states that imagine themselves in terms of idealized concepts such as freedom, justice, democracy. Not surprisingly, they can be highly fraught projects. At their best, victim memorials point the way to civic engagement and social and political transformation. At their worst, they reinscribe the reasons for their existence. Consider, for example, this memorial commemorating the victims of what some people call Rhodesia's 9/11. This was dedicated in 2012. In 1978, and then again in 1979, ZIPRA insurgents, Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, shot down 2 Vickers-Viscount Air Rhodesia airplanes with surface-to-air missiles, killing 107 people. The Viscount Memorial that we see here features the names of the murdered passengers and crew, an abstract symbol representing an airplane, and text stating that these acts of terrorism were, quote, the first 9/11 styled attacks to destroy passenger aircraft. Located on the grounds of Pretoria's Voortrekker Monument, itself a problematic site of colonialist and apartheid memory, the Viscount Memorial co-opts 9/11 in order to recast Rhodesia as victim rather than racist perpetrator, and thereby revamp Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in the global imagination. As one backer of the memorial remarked, the whole world already knows and condemns the Lockerbie and Twin Towers 9/11 style terrorist attacks. There is no better catalyst for gaining international recognition for our cause than to publicize Rhodesia's 9/11. Ironically, what once shattered the nation now holds the key to winning back our honor, end of quote. In his work on postcolonial haunting and victimization, Michael O'Reilly explains that the lingering aesthetics of colonialization, colonialism in general, its sites of memory, nostalgia, and imagery, not only fuel claims to territory, but create enabling paradigms of martyrdom and victimization. While growing numbers of victim memorials suggest a reorientation of the national body politic, the haunting traces of colonialism often prohibit transformative national futures by enabling further acts of terrorism and more victims. Worldwide interest, yet, in the image of the victim have made victim memorials among today's most popular tourist attractions. In 2006, the Nanjing Massacre Memorial received over 3 million visitors. In 2010, 1.4 million people visited the death camps at Auschwitz-Birkenau. In 2011, an estimated 40,000 foreigners visited Rwanda's Genocide Museum in Kigali, built in memory of the 1 million Tutsis and Hutus who were murdered during Rwanda's 1994 civil war. The House of Slaves on Gorée Island, Senegal, where thousands of Africans were imprisoned before being shipped to the Americas, receives some 200,000 visitors a year. Many of them African Americans making pilgrimages to ancestral homes. Likewise, Eastern European concentration camps are visited each year by thousands of American and Israeli Jews, similarly participating in what is called roots or heritage tourism. In the United States, memorials to the victims of terrorism see thousands of visitors. More than 600,000 people visit the Oklahoma City National Memorial each year, which commemorates the 168 people who died because of Timothy McVeigh's murderous act of terrorism in 1995. We see President Clinton at the dedication ceremonies on the left. Since opening in September of 2011, more than 12 million people have visited New York's 9/11 Memorial at the World Trade Center. And in 2013, 265,000 people visited the Flight 93 National Memorial, located in a remote field just about an hour and a half away from here, where one of the planes hijacked by a terrorist on September 11, 2001 crashed, killing everyone on board. For some visitors, victim memorials are alluring because of their grim authenticity, their proof of real-life tragedy. Many of these are located directly where the horrible deaths and disasters that they commemorate occurred. The memorial to the victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is located on the building itself, which is now owned by New York University, and just a few steps from Washington Square Park. And of course, the two huge pools of New York's 9/11 Memorial occupy the footprints of the Twin Towers that once stood there. Likewise, the two huge gates at either end of Oklahoma City's memorial frame both the actual physical location where McVeigh's victims were murdered. And if you see on the right the chairs that are laid out in the memorial, that's as if the building they were in flopped on its side, and they're sort of marked according to what floor they were in, what office they were in, and the graves are situated according to where they died in that building. You'll note, too, that the gates are framed in terms of the moment of the blast that killed them, 9:02 a.m. on April 19, 1995. So the memorial's east gate is etched with 9:01, and its west gate, 9:03, meaning that the memorial attempts to recreate and visitors re-experience the temporal and spatial dislocations rendered by McVeigh's terrorist actions. Yet, our privileged feelings are those of grief and gratitude, with sorrow that so many died, and with thanks that we were not among them. Victim memorials remind us of our own fortunate existence and maybe prompt social and political obligations as well. Victim memorial tourism, part of a larger industry called tragic tourism and dark tourism, is encouraged by various tourism and public art initiatives. Over the past decade, Norway has spent $400 million and commissioned several hundred artists and architects to design bridges, kiosks, scenic overlooks, and memorials along 18 different highways spanning the country's 15,000-mile coastline, all part of a national economic incentive to draw tourists to remote and under-visited parts of the country. Most people who visit Norway simply go to Oslo and maybe Bergen, and it's a really big country, as these maps indicate on the left. So this is a tourist initiative to get folks to actually drive the coastline. And these are some examples of the really breathtaking kind of public art that's been established along the highways. If anybody wants to organize a trip to Norway, let me know. Vardø, a former fishing village situated on a treeless island in Norway's Arctic Northwest, a craggy outpost close to Finland, Russia, and Sweden, I think features one of the most haunting of these new destinations, the Stilneset Memorial for the victims of the Finnmark witch trials. Designed by Peter Zumthor and featuring an installation by Louise Bourgeois. This was a posthumous project, and she died in 2010. The memorial pays tribute to 91 people executed for sorcery in Vardø between 1601 and 1692. The hysterical persecution of witches was hardly confined to this region of Norway, of course, but was rife all over late medieval Europe and Great Britain, and then spread to colonial America in places like Salem, Massachusetts. Persecution in Vardø, however, was extensive and unforgiving. Of 135 people accused of practicing witchcraft in the region, 2/3 were executed. Vardø's victims, 77 women, 14 men, 91 altogether, and many of them Sami people, indigenous people, were tried, tortured, and burnt at the stake at Stilneset. The memorial dedicated to them is located exactly on the site where they were killed, within view of Vardø's Lutheran Church and its graveyard and its former fish warehouses. Today, Vardø's fishing industry is almost completely defunct, taken over by offshore trawlers that ship fish directly to processing plants in China. Today, the country relies on state subsidies and tourism. An annual snowball tournament, which we see on the lower right, attracts many people. So do the island's seabird sanctuaries. In 1912, Vardø hosted Kommafest, a street art project focused on northern Norway's general depopulation issues. Artists included Colin Harrington, Steve Powers, and Veals, fairly well-known European street artists who painted murals on buildings all over the village. One of them, painted by French artist Remed on the site of a former seafood warehouse, included the text Heliga Hex Fortuna, or Holy Witch. Vardø's memorial to the victims of its 17th century witch trials consists of two buildings, Memorial Hall and Glass Pavilion, both designed by Zumthor. The first is a very long, about 125 meters, horizontal structure, elevated off the rocky ground, accessible by ramps, and inspired by traditional wooden racks that were once used to dry fish in the region. Inside the timber scaffolding is a pale gray container made out of heavy sailcloth, shaped like the carcass of a fish, speckled with 91 small windows and 91 naked light bulbs suspended from electric cables. Zumthor explains that after visiting Vardø in 2007 and seeing lamps in the windows of the few houses still inhabited on the island, on the village, he came up with the idea of devoting a window to each of the victims that looks out onto the landscape and lights up at night. Next to each window are black silk panels inscribed with historical information on each of the victims of Vardø's witch hunt. Taken from the original court records of the witch trials, the text include the charges against the victims, the evidence, their pleas, and their sentences. The particular details of accusation, torture, confession, and manner of death are actually plentiful. Like modern bureaucrats, post-Reformation zealots took careful notes on those they surveilled and eventually condemned as social and political threats. The regional state archives in Tromsø, Norway, is packed with their court transcriptions, logbooks, and lists. Maintained for centuries, records like these have only recently drawn the attention of scholars and publics, increasingly attuned to history's shameful chapters, to the aberrations of justice and the sinister workings of state power, religious intolerance, and popular prejudice. The memorial's second building, a small box-like shape framed with corten steel columns and smoked glass panels, houses bourgeois' installation, which is titled The Damned, The Possessed, The Beloved. A metal chair is centered inside, contained within a sloping cone of cement, and shooting flames from the gas jets attached to its seat. Above the burning chair are 7 oval-shaped mirrors, each reflecting the eerie, contorted shapes cast by the flames below. Open to the elements, the walls stop short of the ceiling and include gaps to allow for drafts of wind. The glass pavilion is often buffeted by snow. Despite the presence of perpetual fire, bourgeois' installation is somber and disturbing. The reflections in the mirrors evoke the tortured, writhing bodies of Vardø's victims burning at the stake. The single chair alludes to falsely accused individuals targeted by maniacal, vindictive groups. It bears witness to a wretched episode in human history, writes one critic, adding, in reenacting the repressed crimes that happened in Vardø, bourgeois' installation, coupled with Zumthor's understated architecture, is a compelling plea for empathy with people destroyed by the fires of collective madness. His comments address the transformative potential of this and other victim memorials. Originally commissioned to attract tourists, the Stilneset Memorial to the victims of the Finnmark witch trials has helped put Vardø on the cultural destination map. Zumthor's design has been widely praised. I love this image because, as you might guess, this memorial is probably only seen between May and October, and this is what it looks like the rest of the year. But it has been widely praised. In 2011, Architectural Digest called this one of the 10 most significant memorials of the modern age. Its significance lies both in its compelling aesthetic form and its recovery of the region's shameful history of persecution and violence. But beyond historical reclamation, the memorial sets the stage for the formation of historical consciousness in the present. As Norway's Queen Sonja, and we see her on the bottom left inside at the dedication ceremony, as she remarked in June of 2011, Stilneset is a symbol of the intolerance of the period that can also serve to remind us of the prejudices, injustices, and persecution that exist today. Vardø, for example, employs more than a dozen lawyers who work for the State Compensation Office, dealing with victims of violent crime. High unemployment and poverty are related to escalating incidents of domestic violence in the region. Cultural projects like the Stilneset Victim Memorial and the murals painted during Komafest aim to counter historical amnesia about awful events in Vardø's past and the bleakness of its economically depressed present, with new narratives, perhaps, of human rights and hope. During Komafest, for example, artists and locals joined together in a collective town cleanup, clearing rubbish from long-abandoned lots and even restoring this 100-year-old movie theater that had been closed for decades. Vardø is also pursuing new state-sponsored energy initiatives in the region that would employ hundreds. The meaning that victim memorials have for today's audiences, their abilities to link the past with the present, to evoke responses of personal responsibility and social obligation, and to become sites of conscience, rest especially on their affective and emotional dimensions. As Zumthor observes, my main aim is to make emotional spaces, to create not just a beautiful space, but a space that touches me, that has emotional impact. As a boy, when I saw memorials of generals on horses, I thought they were so boring. I tried to do everything possible here not to have a general on a horse, but an emotional space that brings you as close as possible to the historical dimension. The affect generated at Stalneset's Victim Memorial is that of shame, the shameful failure of a society to behave on just and humane terms. By recovering this shame, Vardo, and by extension Norway, admit their abdication of justice and resolve to right historical wrongs by seeking a more ethical present. As sites of conscience, victim memorials have then the potential to affirm and build civic voice and critical democratic engagement. Linking memory and history on emotionally engaged terms, such memorials suggest the transformative possibilities of contemporary commemorative landscapes. Thank you.
There's plenty of time for questions.
I'd be happy to talk with you. Comments, questions, debate, rebuttal. It's a beautiful memorial.
That was lovely, thank you. Really so interesting. And I'm wondering if you can talk for a minute about tensions that you have thought about or see between this, the act of aestheticizing violence and the retention or emptying out of its social content.
Right.
And I feel like that's implicit in everything you're saying,
I've been working on this project for a long time, and I started actually by becoming engaged in writing about the Duluth Memorial. And there are images of the lynching that I used to talk about and show. And after a while, talking to people and realizing, wait, we've got images of African American men who have been horribly violated physically, and we've got images of white men standing around them as if they're posing with a trophy. What does this do? Well, it perpetuates, revivifies ideas about who's a victim and who's a survivor, who's in power. And so I came to a personal decision to stop showing those images. And so a lot of this project and talking about victims and talking about these projects has also forced me to rethink, well, what rights do we have to certain images? What rights do we have in making this kind of art or even thinking about memorials in terms of atonement for reproducing the violence and victimization that they came out of? I don't have any answers for that, but it certainly made me rethink a lot of just basic assumptions that I had about, we need to see the victims. No, we don't. If those images serve to do nothing more than sort of perpetuate these divisions of who's a victim and who's the victimizer. So that's one aspect of it. So. Yes?
Thanks. So at the very end, you mentioned something like this memorial in particular commemorates the failure of a society or community to behave on just terms, just and humane terms, which I thought was interesting because if those terms are somehow historically contingent, then the memorials, in a way, also represent how those terms change, right? Like how reprehensible the society is for their actions is a standard that changes over time, right? So,
absolutely.
Yeah. So if it's the case that these terms change, do you think that the memorials somehow reflect that progress and evolution?
I think that everything that I've said has a next part. In other words, it is historically contingent on the next history. Yeah. And I can't predict that, although I can imagine our futures. But no, you're absolutely right. This thing itself, just physically, I can't imagine it's going to last more than a decade or so. I mean,
in
this
extreme winters. Of
absolutely. I mean, I showed you the image of it being buffeted, right? I don't know if I can go backwards here. This is not going to last long. And and Zumthor's kind of known, like a Gary to a degree, for using material. But that's not what it's about. This isn't about the permanent, this is it, this is the change. This is about a moment of rethinking the past in this contemporary present. And I think that folks who are engaged at it on this level have no doubt that this is just, as I was saying about memory, the presentist conditions here. So your points are absolutely well-founded.
So I actually had a connected question. You did a very good job of not revealing your own sort of feelings about these memorials. On the one hand, the sheer number of them, it almost has a compromising effect on their message, right? Like,
absolutely. I mean, the guy who writes about Kirk Savage and I both know him. James Young writes about memorials extensively, and what he says is we shouldn't be making these. We should always constantly be involved in what he calls memory work. In other words, when you make a memorial and you finish making it, so many people then have the tendency to go, done, I can move on now, closure, that whole thing. And he says, no, that is not what memory, particularly traumatic memory, should be about. So I think that a lot of memorials are being made by publics, diverse publics, who sort of want to come to closure. You can't come to closure on this stuff. And so that's one way of looking at it. On the other hand, there's the whole argument about rights and representation and making visible that which has been marginalized or ignored, so that plays into it as well. I remain hopeful. I would actually rather have more stuff out there to maybe start dialogue and conversation about these historical issues than just do the memory work. I also think it's an enormous creative possibility for contemporary artists. So maybe get away from the market and play with memorials. So. In the back, yes.
Me?
Yes.
Okay. You were saying like they're rethinking how when they come back to these issues and show the memorials there and build them, they're rethinking certain issues. Like I think you were saying with the presidents there, but they're ending it. Do you think the purpose of these memorials that you were showing us here, most of them, are to end these issues or like rethink what happened? Like you were saying.
I think that, okay, so over here the gentleman is saying I don't show my cards, but actually I think I have shown my cards, which is I prefer to talk about memorials that are not just about the past, that have something to do with a rethinking or transformation of the present. So for me, I'm really interested in this memorial that Wojcicko did in France, and I'm interested in this one because they're layered into, in the case in France, sex trafficking and human trafficking that's going through that port. They don't know what to do with it, but they know that one way to start thinking about it is go back in their history and recognize this is nothing new. So we need to talk about the past in order to figure out the present. And in a sense, that's what's going on here as well. Don't cover it up, sort of bring it out, and then are there new ways of thinking about or reforming the present? I'm not a sociologist, so I can't give you qualitative data on the fact that, yes, there's been less domestic violence since the project went up. This is all very, very conceptual. It's all very speculative. Kirk.
Well, I have a question about, I wanted to hear some thoughts from you about what you thought were the conditions under which sites or conscience, as you call them, can actually be created, and when it's really not possible, or when they go awry.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this particularly because I just, a few weeks ago, heard this very depressing talk from my former advisor, Del Upton, who's been working on civil rights memorials for a long time. And so he did a talk on the monument in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is supposed to be a kind of restitution to the victims of that terrible, what used to be called race riot, but was in fact a white supremacist coup and massacre that took place in 1898. And the monument that has been erected is one that really avoids any kind of genuine moral accounting, and that's largely because some of the people who put up the money for the monument are the descendants of the perpetrators of that, and they're still in power locally. And they have refused, to apologize or to recognize that, anything that their families did was wrong. And so they've turned it into a weird kind of thing, a rhetoric of inclusion. They said we're honoring our African American, citizens here, but not really accounting for what happened there. And as opposed to the Duluth Memorial, which really, what's so impressive about that is that, the descendants of the perpetrators were there, and they were part of the process.
Right, at the dedication ceremony for the Duluth Memorial, the great-grandson of one of the perpetrators, there were 10,000 people in the mob. Only 3 people went on trial, maybe 8, and only 3 of them served about 18 months or so. Great-grandson found out that he was, in fact, related to one of the perpetrators. He was invited to the dedication ceremony, and he gave this incredibly heartfelt speech at the dedication ceremony in which he said, it isn't enough for me to apologize for what my family did in the past. It was beyond inclusion. It was incredibly, It was very smart. Well, the case in Wilmington is just messed up. What were they trying to,
So but there are, you showed a number of examples, like the Rhodesian example, or Bush using, it's become now a language in which you can use, the victimization language to promote a political agenda rather than, to promote a particular agenda rather than a coming to a true accounting of what for the past.
I know, and I think that the first thing that you said, the money. If the money is guiding the memorial, that can be very problematic in terms of what the patrons or the funders are deciding is the historical message. That wasn't the case in Duluth. In Duluth, there was no money, so people had to come together and raise the money. It has interestingly been the case, I suppose, in Norway, where you had $400 million, but then they also invited really smart and politically engaged artists to work on these projects. Another one is a project by Mark Dion, who was invited to come in to do this fabulous sort of drive down the highway, stop, go to the restrooms, and then walk down about 50 feet to a cave where he's done a sort of archaeological debris pile up, and then there's a bear in there, and it's funny, but it's super smart. So they had the money to actually do that. The situation that you're talking about in Wilmington is cover-up money, if you will, right?
Could I follow Erika? Okay, so in Australia we had a debate about memorials probably around at the time, particularly those relating to the memory of the massacres and wiping out Indigenous people. And the Conservative Prime Minister regarded that whole enterprise is what he called black armband history. Black armband history, which is a great metaphor because it raises the idea not only that the people talking about all this are obsessed with death, black armbands, but they're fascists as well. In other words, the people who have a kind of critical take and want to actually make sure that we remember history in a critical fashion are somehow imposing their view on the innocent neoliberal presence. So, I don't know. So my question really, there's a couple of questions involved to follow from that. I didn't actually hear a whole lot about the fact that as you imply in your answers, that all of this is operative within an enormous debate that tends to split in different directions in different countries. It also varies because, as opposed to the United States, most other public memorials in many other countries are in fact public and not, you can't actually do a memorial from a small group or whatever, it's not how it's done. But putting that on the side, one of the critiques that I think can be made or could be raised, or at least a question about the minimalist style memorial, is that it's in fact a ground or field of compromise between irreconcilable viewpoints. And so minimalism or very abstract memorials allow both sides to still, as it were, surround the event.
Sure.
And you don't pitch in either direction. It could be that this memorial will in fact last forever because it's such a great artwork.
You think they'll just keep remaking it? I don't know. Maybe.
It'll become something more than a memorial, it'll become an artwork. I think in a certain way, Arad's memorial wants to be more than one of these. It wants to be amazing. And so there's a kind of to sort of transcend the situations we're talking about. But underlying that question is this one. Have you looked at what the right or the neoliberals or the people with power have kept on doing to commemorate themselves? Because in effect, the lecture is about they were there first and then they've been taken.
I could have put all their stuff in as well.
Yeah, so what's this
but I'd
stuff
rather
like?
not.
What's the shape? Is it still going
Well,
on?
let's just go with the National World War II Memorial and end it right there.
Oh,
I mean, there's tons of it, right? But that, and I don't even know if there's this divide. I don't really want to say that there's a divide, although that one sets up the divide pretty well. Of course, war memorials, which are the #1 memorial being made in the country, they're plentiful and they're made every minute. War memorials don't account for victims. They account for soldier dead, to be sure. They're heroic. Some of these victim memorials are also fairly heroic in that victimization ideology. I'm not even sure, and I think that's one important point that I was trying to make. I'm not even sure that the embrace of the victim by some of these groups isn't neoliberal. That's what I'm saying, and especially with the Rhodesia stuff in terms of we're going to use the victims in order to perpetuate and get back to how it was. Really? And I stumbled onto that because I'm fascinated with the sort of transnational politics of 9/11 memorials. There are dozens of them all over the world now, and what does that say about us, empire, and victimization?
Right.
So, in any case, of course I agree with you on the minimalist aesthetic that can be read from both the right and from the left. You guys are probably aware about the changes in terms of audience understandings of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial over the last couple of decades. But I'm not sure that's what's going on here. Zumthor had a choice. He could have simply made this very abstract space, like most of his architecture, but it's pretty deeply engaged in a recovery of history, which made it interesting to me, and to a degree the same project that she comes up with. So it's layered.
Yeah, it's got just a quick comment. It's got a great columba in Cologne, which in fact memorializes a church inside itself. Gives you a little church, gives you a space to remember it being destroyed, and then gives you an art museum.
Right.
Is a layered way of doing that.
Yeah. So. Yes.
A big difference that I've kind of noticed, and given that maybe not this one, but a lot of memorials are semi-permanent for history and posterity, when heroes are memorialized, put heroes in quotes, big quotes. So you have the World War II memorial. It focuses on, the virtues that people were implied with that: heroicism, valor, honor. And even though they might memorialize the hero, whether it's a president or anything like that, it often tries to take the positive virtues that people want in the monument itself. With the victim memorials, what focus is there on the actual evil committed besides just memorializing the victim? Because throughout history, are we trying to remember the victim or preventing that sort of evil from perpetuating itself?
Right. In this memorial, I think it would be simply reading the text, standing in the space where the executed were burned, sort of recovering that. It's not simply, it's not in the physical itself, it's part of the text. The text is pretty layered. It goes through all of the accusations and then it talks about what happened to them physically. So that would be the evil, and it doesn't make those kinds of connections between this is then and this is what's going on now. Nothing is as blunt as that in these particular projects. What I'm arguing is that people who go here including locals who go here, are going to be able to put the past together with the present. So, yeah.
Of those, do you think that most of these memorials that are they state-sponsored more than the gathering of funds through like Duluth, I think you said, was more people put funds together to build that, to memorialize that? Are you seeing more of that happening, or does it seem like more are state-sponsored like you was mentioning?
State funds in the United States of America, where we will no longer have an NEH in about 5 minutes. Europe, right? 400 million. Norway, right? Oil, say no more. So this is all about state funding. In the United States, even the National World War II Memorial, what did it cost? I want to say almost 200 million, maybe 20 million coming in from the feds. Everything else was raised. And Duluth, 15,000 from the Minnesota Historical Society, and everything else was raised by. Yeah, no, we don't have any state-sponsored stuff in the, not really. National Park Service, like the Flight 93 Memorial, which was declared the national memorial for 9/11. I would say the majority of the funding for the project came from the feds, but there was also private and all sorts of donations that come in. That's sort of how we operate. So, yeah.
A question with regard to one of the elements that you referred to at the very beginning. That's the issue of the relationship between national identity and the production of memorials. Memorials that are devoted to Korean women on American soil and the debates surrounding this. This is very interesting for me because you also refer to the question of sort of international tourism or pilgrimages of memory and of victimization. But I wanted to ask you how the division between victims and winners that we find. Winners were presented in the old memorials, now we have memorials devoted to the victims, is in a way still part of a narrative that is written by the winners.
Sure.
I'm saying this because I'm very interested in some memorials that in Europe were devoted to the victims of the fascist and Nazi regimes in Germany, in Italy. In Germany in particular, there were several problems when it came to restore monuments that were built in the Eastern Bloc, in the eastern part of the country, by that government after the wall fell.
Right.
What do we do with the ideology that was embodied in that sort of narrative of what was the winner's discourse at that time? So, how do you see the if you want, this issue of displacement, but also this issue of the movement in political regimes?
Right. I'll go back to an American example, which is Civil War memorials, and in particular Confederate Civil War memorials. And it's interesting, there have been a couple of episodes in the last couple of years where some of these Confederate Civil War memorials have been damaged. A couple of years ago, someone drove their van into not on purpose, although, into a Confederate Civil War memorial. And the thing, which was a standing soldier memorial, a figure on top of a very large plinth, crashed and it just totally destroyed. So that opened up a really interesting conversation in the town of Reidsville, South Carolina, I believe is the town. Whoa, what should we do? And so it became a very divisive conversation. There were a lot of people that said, finally, we don't have to deal with this, goodbye, goodbye. But there were other people who said, oh no, we need to restore the memorial and put it back. So now you had sort of competing conversation about the retention of Confederate memory and Confederate history in a very changed southern town. And there is a conclusion to that story, which is, I think that they rebuilt it and placed it somewhere else on private land. So, but it would no longer dominate in that particular public space, public square. So there are all kinds of stories like that. There's been a lot of graffiti and vandalism of Confederate memorials over the last couple of decades. And I actually see it sort of increasing for exactly those, those conversational aspects. So, Yes.
So my question has to do with the idea of what's remembered in memorials, because it seems like the names and the sites to some degree are generally remembered among many memorials, but some of the memorials you showed have statues of, for example, the Holocaust Memorial, a bunch of bodies in a pile. The one in Norway has a lot of biographical details about the victims. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the types of value judgments that go into deciding what sort of details of the memorial, or of the event that the memorial is commemorating, to choose to bring out within the memorial itself.
Yeah, and that goes back to the first question about, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, sort of the aesthetics. The Holocaust Memorial with the bodies is in Florida, and it's one of the very earliest Holocaust memorials made in this country. I don't think a memorial like that would be made over the last 15, 20 years, because there are different ways of thinking about the Holocaust, and sort of the repetition of that imagery is not needed. The text issue, it sort of continues. I mean, people say, well, what would have happened if Maya Lin had just made a memorial without the names? It would have been a really different memorial. The names, in a sense, make the project. You touch the names, you copy the names, you look up the names. So text is important. How much text? This memorial is deep in text. But that's kind of the point that I think he and certainly I want to make, which is this was authenticated again and again and again. And it's so interesting to me that it's only been sort of recovered in most recent decades. This material has been sitting around. This history has been stowed away and waiting for us to remember, because the folks who engaged in this kind of violence wanted to record it. They felt that what they were doing was significant. I don't know how to go much further with your question. So, in the back.
Yeah, a couple, I think, related questions about something you touched on, I think, only briefly in the presentation, and that was victims of accidents.
Mm-hmm.
So you had a brief reference to the highway crosses that we see in so many places, and then I think you showed one that was a memorial to victims of an airplane crash.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the two questions that emerged for me out of that one would be, in your research, are you doing comparative kind of study of memorials that are about more like accidental crashes and loss of life? And then the second question would be, are you doing any research on popularly or spontaneous construction of memorials like the highway crosses?
Yeah, in my book Memorial Mania, which is sort of divided up in terms of affect, the chapter on grief goes extensively into a discussion of temporary or spontaneous memorials, mainly focused on the United States, but I sort of look globally in terms of the centuries-long practice of erecting crosses or leaving some sort of materials, sacred materials at the sites of deaths on highways, accidental deaths. I'm not particularly interested in or focusing on the airplane memorials. I'm just sort of interested in, how many there are, and how, back to the original sort of discussion, there seems to be an assumption that a memorial will be made to a plane crash, to a train accident, to the youthful teenage victim of a car accident. And that if you don't do that, you are somehow forgetting, not respecting, not providing either the emotional space or the kind of memory that is necessary for those kinds of events and historical episodes. Now, this is not new. In the 19th century, there were markers, there were parades, there were all sorts of ways in which train accidents, for example, were represented and remembered, but not to the degree of the kinds of and numbers of kinds of memorials that we're seeing today. So, yeah.
But that's kind of interesting to me, how victimization has become the lingua franca of a kind of transnational memorial culture. I'm still trying to get at that in my own mind, why that's so. And I'm looking at this, and one of the things that this does for me, if it was a memorial or a monument to the Queen, okay, this would be so marked nationally in a way that it would be sort of irrelevant within my horizon of thinking about it. But I mean, all of a sudden, this landscape, which is so remote, becomes marked by history, and history that connects it to something that I can understand through my own sort of historical knowledge of my culture and that sort of thing. So there's some kind of evocation of an empathic response that something like this works better, I would say, in a transnational context than a heroic monument or even a happy one. It's like, you know, no nation wants to hear that another nation is happier, right? So you know, happy memorials don't fight to it either.
But you're bringing up the idea too of my victimization is worse than yours. My country has suffered more than yours. My nation state, we had more victims than yours. And I see that with some of these memorials, certainly. We don't have to name names. This one doesn't necessarily do that. Yes, it's putting victimization on the map, but it's doing so in sorts of ways that I agree with you. I find this more affective, and rather than sort of political propaganda in some ways. So. Yes?
This question of victimization, I'm thinking, Maureen, about your point about car crashes and plane crashes, which present themselves. I know they're not ideologically neutral, but they can be presented as ideologically neutral. And I'm thinking about the ideological processes, and I feel like I'm asking a really obvious question, and you'll see my point when I get to the end of it. But the ideological processes that conceal or allow a public constitution of victimization. So I'm thinking about the high prevalence of gun violence in this country, and yes, there are personal memorials to that when things happen, but I'm trying to think about actual public memorials to victims of gun violence since 1970 in this country.
It depends on who gets media coverage, right? I mean, when Gifford was shot in Tucson, major media coverage, huge temporary memorial.
Yes. No, but I'm thinking about like well, that one is going to go away. But
a permanent memorial.
Permanent,
yeah.
You know, and I feel like I'm asking a really obvious question.
The victims of
ideologically conflicted.
Right. I mean, victims of gun violence memorials in terms of permanence are few. There's one gun violent. It's more about guns, really, in front of the National Policeman something or other in Washington, which is made out of guns. And that's about as close as we get. Most of them are temporary. I know that they are working in Tucson on a permanent memorial to the shootings. And they are caught up in quite fraught conversation about, well, what is it that we are memorializing here? A horrible thing that happened because of guns, or et cetera, et cetera. It's complicated, as you can well imagine. Can anybody think of permanent memorials in this country?
Victimization becomes recognizable through this process of memorializing.
I don't think gun victimization is at all acknowledged beyond a 24, 48-hour CNN news blip. Yeah?
Virginia Tech, Columbine, 4th issue.
Yeah, you're right. Columbine, which I've even written about. I should have remembered that one. Does Virginia Tech have a permanent memorial?
I believe it does, but
I think you're right.
Like, I'm not 100% on that
Yeah.
one. And
yeah.
I visited Fort Hood after that, the first instance.
Oh, yeah.
And they were working to break ground. I was looking on Google before to find out for sure, but I'm not positive on that one either. But they were planning on doing it, and with the second instance,
yeah, the one at Columbine, which is the one I know the best, is it's problematic. I mean, it's basically a memorial to 13 kids who died, and some teachers. No real reference to why, what, how.
They're working on one for Sandy.
They're working on one for
Sandy Hook.
Fort Arthur in Tasmania. That goes back to the 90s.
Right, and in Australia, actually, the one for the, I can't remember the name of the ship that they allowed 380 people to drown. The children and women were trying to come over and meet their family members. It starts with a C, I can't remember it. But they did a temporary memorial with the poles, and I think they're trying to create a
And there's another, I just thought of another gun violence in Quebec, the first mass shooting.
Oh yeah, no, you're absolutely right, but that's Canada. There is a difference. Yeah.
Slightly different take on a school shooting that has a memorial to it, Kent State.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a bunch of memorials there too. Some are more effective than others. No, you're absolutely right. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, this is I'm interested in this relationship between the aesthetic force of a memorial on the one hand, and then its social and political content on the other. And sometimes I think of that in terms of minimalism and relational aesthetics. And the example I'd love to use, but it won't fit because we don't have it, it would be Arad's reflecting absence on one hand, which we do have here, but then Wojcicki's reply to it in City of Refuge, where he puts more emphasis on the political and social content and how to organize the space. That is, I talk about having a geometric aesthetic of democracy because it's spherical. When people relate to one another, they have to do it in a non-hierarchical manner. Whereas with Arad's reflecting absence, you have all the aesthetic force, but what it means and where it goes gets a little bit lost. But I didn't want to go into that because we don't have Wojcicki's images here because it's never been built for one thing.
Yeah.
But we do. I was really interested in this because it has a lot of aesthetic force, I think. And then we get some of the social and political content with the plaques and the messages. But then we get an extension of that with the things you mentioned about that it's also as related to it, a lawyer group who get pro bono work, and then the idea of a collective town cleanup that's related to it, and also green technology. I think there are a couple of other things. So we get on the one hand a very strong aesthetic force, and then we get some political content in terms of the plaques, almost like names in a way, because you can also touch those, I think. And then you get this further extension of the way it organizes people around it to come in with this collective activity. And so when I try to think of what just this perfect balance is, of course there is no such thing, but between the aesthetic force on the one hand and social and political content, where it also means this broader extension of the way that the art object will organize people around it in a way that gives us new ideas of community, for example. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about that, and your feelings about Bardo, and that issue of aesthetic force on the one hand and the social question.
Let me see if I can do some more images. There we go. Well, I haven't been. So I can't talk about it in terms of my own physical response.
Those images help.
I also think this is a thing that the people in Bardo see sort of across the bay. It's a presence, but not dominating. It's constantly sort of within their vision. I think it's so smart the way that he, inside the project, has windows looking out on. I mean, there's this communicative thing that's going back and forth. I mean, in terms of aesthetic force, it's just smart, but it's also visually appealing, compelling. All of the other stuff is add-on, but it's got to start with this kind of sort of work to begin with. I know that sounds really art history, and it's very much about the appeal of the formal, but I was immediately drawn to this project. On the other hand, I'm also drawn to the Duluth Memorial, which people have come up to me and said, how can you work on such garbage art? And they're right, it's not a stellar example. But then for me, the story there is, I don't care. This is about people in Duluth came together, wanted to do this, and it has this annual sort of, or daily memory attached to it, where they do all kinds of amazing things. So I'm kind of with you and not with you. I mean, and I really do go back to James Young, because I think it's about the memory work more than the projects themselves.
The processal aspect of it.
Definitely.
And his memory notion carries that too. With these community activities built around it, that does allow for a lot of processual change.
Right.
So I'm wondering if that might work in that emphasis.
I mean, and that goes back to the question, about historical contingency. Yeah, let's think about this in terms of practice. Let's think about this in terms of the potential for transformation. Let's not think about this in terms of closure and static presentation of the object that's going to solve all the problems of the world, which is sort of what so many people have come to expect of public art, and I think is just erroneous. So, thanks. You guys have been a great audience.